to be creative, you need to be really persistent. People are not going to like your ideas for the most part. And even if they do, you're going to have a lot of people who pick holes in them. And you have to be very resilient and willing to face obstacles and overcome them.
That was Dr. Robert Sternberg, a leading creativity researcher and a professor of psychology at Cornell University. You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. I'm your host, Dr. Keith Sawyer. Professor Sternberg is a prolific scholar whose research helps us understand ourselves. He's done groundbreaking research on the most important issues in psychology, including scientific studies of wisdom, love, hate, leadership, and, of course, creativity. Dr. Sternberg is known for reforming college admissions requirements to include measures of creativity, which he did while a dean at both Tufts University and at Oklahoma State University. He's published literally thousands of books and scientific articles, and his research has been cited by other scholars over 8,000 times. Our interview touches on topics that give our life meaning, including love, wisdom, and creativity. His research represents the best that we have in the science of creativity. I'm here with Dr. Robert Sternberg, who's one of the best-known psychologists in the United States today. I'm delighted to have you on the program. Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. I appreciate your having me.
Well, you've had such a long and productive career, and you've studied so many of the most important topics in psychology, really most important topics about people, and those include intelligence, wisdom, love, hate, expertise, leadership. And when I say you've studied them, I mean you've done serious psychological research on all those topics and, of course, creativity. So for our listeners, can you say, why creativity with all those other important topics you can be studying? Would you put creativity up there on that list?
Well, sure. I think it's up on that list. I think creativity is especially important today when the world changes at such an incredibly rapid rate. As a professor, for example, this year I'm having to deal with generative AI, which I did not have to deal with in the past, and no one else did either. And who knows what will happen next month. So, and tomorrow we're doing this on November 4th. Tomorrow there's an election that could change the course of the United States. So without creativity, it's really hard to function in today's world. However, the reason I started studying it was a personal experience. Pretty much everything I study is something I don't do well. And so when I was in my first year of graduate school at Stanford, I was invited to the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences by my undergraduate advisor, whose name was Endel Tolving, great guy who was spending time there. And he asked me to describe my research. So I described what I did for my first year research project, which was a project negative transfer in part whole and whole part free recall, which does not sound interesting and probably to 99.9% of the population would not be. And so I described to Endel's colleagues at the center my study and that it went really well. But I said, I don't plan to continue to study negative transfer, but rather I want to study intelligence. And they asked me, well, how are you going to do that? And I had not been anticipating this question, and I actually had no idea. And I said, well, to be honest, I don't know. And they looked at me with pitying looks as though, well, this is a real shame because here's a one-idea guy. And usually one-idea men at least last until their 30s. But the time I was 22, And it looked like I was bombing out at the age of 22. So I became interested in why. I didn't have any ideas at that point for studying intelligence. And I realized that I was just waiting for this grand inspiration to come, this sort of eureka experience that would tell me this is how you should study intelligence. And I realized that wasn't going to happen. That's kind of like hoping God will talk to you or something. So I actively started looking in my environment for ways I could study intelligence, and I found one. So I studied intelligence, but I kept in mind that I had this embarrassment about not having any creative ideas for what I wanted to study. And so, since I always study things I stink at, later in my career, not much later, started studying creativity.
Well, you said you started out with your interest in intelligence, and then you said that seemed like it might be too narrow, but intelligence seems like a huge topic. You could spend a whole career studying intelligence, couldn't you?
Oh, yeah, I have spent my whole career studying intelligence. I still study it 50 years after I started, almost 50 years after I started my career as an assistant professor at Yale. But I just tend to go where I feel like going in terms of research. I've never had any agenda per se. I'll tell you something that's actually relevant to that. When I was much younger, I published a book on cognitive psychology. And it was a textbook, and I was very proud of it. And a very famous psychologist, cognitive psychologist, came to visit me. And I bragged to him that, well, I just had this textbook come out on cognitive psychology, and I thought you might like to see it. And he looked at me and he said, well, Bob, you're not a cognitive psychologist anymore. You've started studying love, and it doesn't sound like cognitive psychology to me. And when he said that, I was appalled because I had been trained by great cognitive psychologists. Endel Tolving was my undergraduate mentor, and then Gordon Bauer, my graduate mentor, and at Yale, Wendell Garner had been an advisor. And, I felt like I was being exiled from the fraternity of cognitive psychologists. And my first reaction then was to feel a sort of shame. And then when I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, I'm glad he said that because I had always defined myself as a cognitive psychologist. That's what I'd studied in grad school. And I realized that if you define yourself in a narrow way, then you're actually confining your creativity. You're saying, I'm going to only try to be creative in this one field. And I thought, well, I'm not, you're right. I'm not a cognitive psychologist. I'm an anything psychologist or a general psychologist or just someone who does what he feels like doing, which is pretty much the way I've run my career. So, yeah, I could have done just one thing, but I've never really fit into any place or any organization or any particular fraternity of psychologists. I just sort of go my own way.
I think that's a hallmark of your career is this ability to study so many different things. Like I listed at the beginning, you started with intelligence, but you then moved to research on love and you studied creativity. How did you get from intelligence to love? Is there some connection between intelligence and love, or was that just something that you got interested in one summer or one fall semester?
The way I got interested in it is the way I got interested in everything else. In that case, I said I study things I stink at. In that case, I was in a failing relationship and I was trying to figure out why it was failing. And so I started thinking about love and what it was that the relationship I had at that point didn't seem to offer. And that got me going with love. Although my first paper on love, which was with Susan Grajek and is published in Journal of Personality and Social Psychology in 1984, was actually applying psychometric models of intelligence to love, not the content, the structure. So the idea in the first study was love might be like general intelligence, general love, there's this one big squishy thing that pervades everything. Or it might be more like a Thurstonian model that there's, say, 6 or 7 or 8 group factors of love. Or it might be analogous to Thompson's model of intelligence, which is that there'd be all these little bits, all what Thompson called bonds, all these little bits that when you have enough of them that you feel or experience, you then call it love. But as I said, I always start with things that just don't work for me. I never study anything I'm good at because I have no clue why people do it or how they do it. I write easily, so I never studied writing because I don't know why people have trouble writing, but I do know why people have trouble with almost everything else because there's so many things they do badly.
Well, absolutely. That's almost an understatement that you don't have any trouble writing with your, I think over 100 books, several hundred pages on your CV.
Yeah, well, actually, it's not quite accurate because I write easily, but I have trouble writing for lay audiences, for the general public. None of my trade books has really been very successful. So I find it easy to write, but not necessarily in a way that the general public understands, which has really been an annoyance to me throughout my whole career.
Oh, that's great. Later, I'm going to ask you to recommend one of your books for our general listeners. But first, you said something that fascinated me. You referred to this one big squishy thing that might underlie intelligence and love, if I got that right. So, what is that one big squishy thing?
Well, that's the deal. In the field of intelligence, see, Charles Spearman in 1904, which is a few years ago, suggested the idea of a general factor of intelligence. And he posited that it might be mental energy. And now it's 120 years later, and people are still trying to figure out what G is and still don't know. In the field of love, in fact, the G model was wrong. That wasn't the best model. The best model was in that study was the Thompsonian one of bits. But my current theory of love doesn't see love as one thing, but rather as a function of intimacy, which is sort of friendship and trust and getting along with someone and communicating with them and feeling close to them. So that's one component. Passion is a second component. Passion is how excited you are about a person and how just dominating the thought of them is in your life. And commitment is the third component, that you're in it for keeps. And different kinds of love in this part of my general theory have different combinations of those components. That's not the whole theory, but there is no G for love that I'm aware of.
Could you give an example of a scientific study that you've done about love?
Yeah, sure. So my theory has undergone, like most of my theories, development over the years. And since I was just talking about the triangular theory, let's talk about that. So the idea again is that love is a triangle, that not the love triangle kind, a different triangle, that comprises intimacy, passion, and commitment. And if you have just intimacy, you like someone, or if you have just passion, you have infatuated love. If you have just commitment, you have what I call empty love. You're committed, but there's not much else there. If you have intimacy plus passion, that's romantic love. If you have intimacy plus commitment, that's companionate love. If you have passion plus commitment, it's fatuous or foolish love. And if you have all three components, intimacy, passion, commitment, that's consummate or complete love. So the question then is, well, that's nice. How do you know that theory holds water? So we did a construct validation of the theory, where we created a measure of intimacy, a measure of passion, a measure of commitment. And we looked at, do intimacy, passion, and commitment predict satisfaction and happiness in love relationships? And if so, do they all matter the same or differently? And what we found is that we had very high correlations of scores on the intimacy, passion, and commitment scales with satisfaction and happiness and love. So that was good. But it turns out that it's a little more complicated than that, because there are actually two aspects of the triangular part of the theory that are important. One is that you have more of them, so you tend to love people more if you have more intimacy, passion, commitment. But the other part is that your triangles match. In other words, that if, say, you want a lot of intimacy, but you're not so interested in passion, but the other person wants a lot of passion, but isn't so interested in intimacy, you won't be so happy in the relationship because you have mismatching triangles. So we found that the two things immediately that predict happiness are, first, how much of each of those you have, but second, whether the shape and size of the triangle, how much love and how they're distributed, matches your partner. And then there is a third element in the triangular theory. And the third element is that people have an ideal triangle. And the ideal triangle is what they'd ideally like to have in a love relationship. So, how much intimacy, passion, and commitment they want. And as you know, not everyone wants to have super high levels of intimacy in a particular relationship. Or some people may not want to be committed in that particular relationship, or passion may be a non issue for them. So, the third match is the match between the triangle you feel for your partner and what your ideal triangle is. And so what that means is that you could have two people, each of whom, in terms of the love triangle, love their partner the same. You know, they have the same scores for intimacy, passion, and commitment, but one of them is much less happy because, say, she or he really wants a very, very high level of intimacy. And even though the relationship is pretty good at it, it's not just good enough for them. So the three things that matter are the amounts, the match to your partner, and the match to the ideal triangle. Oh, so I forgot the little detail of the study. I'm sorry. So the study showed construct validity, and we also correlated the love measure with other people's love measures to show what's sometimes called convergent validity. And we also found things it's not correlated with. It was called discriminant validity. But much later, with a series of collaborators led by Piotr Sierakowski in Poland, an international construct validation of the triangular theory in 25 countries around the world. And we found that the triangular theory was construct valid in each of the 25 countries. Later, another Polish team led by Marta Kowal, and both of these investigators are at the University of Breslau. And we translated the triangular love scale into 37 different languages and administered it to people really in many parts of the world, and found that the love scale was construct valid for all 37 languages. So the triangular part of the theory, at least, appears to be construct valid not only in the US, but in many countries and across different languages around the world. So that's an example of a study.
It's a fascinating and compelling study, and maybe I could put a link to something in the episode notes. Is there like a newspaper article, or did you write you could have a whole book about love and relationships?
Yeah, it is published. I could send you the reference after we talk, maybe, and then you could link it. Would that be okay?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think people are going to want to know more about that.
Sure.
And I know with your career in psychology, you talk about being a cognitive psychologist. And I read that you've also done some work that you would call social psychology. Now, one thing that's shared by all of these topics you've been interested in, whether it's intelligence or love or creativity, you have a particular set of methodologies that you use to gather data and to, we say, empirically support the claims that you're making. Have you used similar methodologies to study creativity?
I don't know if we've used similar methodologies. I sort of try to use the methodology that's relevant for the particular problem. But we have done construct validations of at least parts of the theory of creativity, and those have shown construct validity for the theory, but I haven't really described the theory, so listeners may not know what I'm talking about. So the theory I proposed in 2018, I called also a triangular theory, and it grew out of work that I earlier did a book with Todd Lubart on what we called an investment theory. But the more recent version of the theory, although not the most recent, the triangular theory is that people who are creative are people who are willing to do three things, willing and able, I should say. One is to defy the crowd, and that means the really important part of I think creativity is mostly a matter of attitude. I know, or disposition. I know I disagree with a lot of people, but I think almost anyone can be creative. Defying the crowd just means that if everyone's doing something, you don't have to do the same thing. That you have the courage to go your own way. Permit me to give you an example. I told you everything I do, studies, all the studies, it sort of comes out of things I'm bad at. When I was in graduate school, my first year, Gordon Bauer had his first year students over for dinner. And after we ate dinner, he sat the five of us down at the table and asked what we wanted to do in our graduate career. And all of us knew, of course, as first year students, that what Gordon was doing at the time was what's sometimes called semantic memory. So, and it doesn't matter what semantic memory is. It's just that's what he was doing. So Gordon asked the first guy what he planned to do in graduate school, and the guy said semantic memory. And then Gordon asked the second guy, and that guy said semantic memory too, which kind of surprised me because I knew that he was really interested in perception. And I had the feeling he was kind of, as we say, brown nosing Gordon to say what he thought Gordon wanted to hear. And then Gordon asked the third guy what he wanted to do. And that guy said, oh, you can guess by now, semantic memory. So I was the fourth guy. They were all guys that year. And Gordon asked me what I wanted to do. And I think you can tell by now that I'm the kind of person who says what's on my mind and does what I want to do. And I don't just, suck up to people because I want them to think highly of me. So when Gordon asked me what I wanted to study, I said semantic memory, which was like a total sellout because I didn't want to study semantic memory. And then I went home that night and was thinking that I can't believe I did that. I just sold myself out to suck up to Gordon, and I said, I don't want to be that person. I don't feel like that was me, and I'm embarrassed I did that. And I kind of told myself that I'm never going to do that again. And to my knowledge, I never have. I mean, I can't swear I never have, but I'm not aware of having done it. And that made me realize, even way before I was ever working with Todd, my former graduate student, who's now a professor at Rene Descartes University in Paris, it made me realize that I was being not only unprincipled, but uncreative because I was just saying what everyone else said. And it reminded me, and it still reminds me of when I was in, oh, I was about the same age as our triplets. Our triplets are 13. And maybe I was a year or two older. I don't know. But anyway, kids at that age are very much into dressing, the right way. And at that time, the way a guy was supposed to dress to get girls interested in him was to wear very tight pants. And I mean, like really tight. And I tend to be claustrophobic. I'm very claustrophobic, actually. And I just hate tight clothing. It makes me feel claustrophobic. So I wore loose pants. And when I wore loose pants, the result was that kids would look at me and, some of them would say, that guy, Sternberg, he's really a dork. And others would say, oh, no, he's not a dork, he's a dweeb. So I was, in a very mundane way, defying the crowd, but I was being myself. And now, with our 13-year-old triplets, I tell the kids, they tell me, well, this year black is in fashion. And Brittany, one of the two girls, one of the two identical girls, likes to wear rainbow colors. I say, just wear what you want. I mean, you have to be yourself. This is the beginning of when you develop a creative attitude. And if you feel like you have to do what others do, then you're already going to be well on the way toward not being a creative adult, because you'll always want to fit in instead of be the person who you really can be. So it's really important, if you want to be creative, to be willing to defy the crowd. But there's a second element, and that is that you need to be willing to defy yourself. And we were actually, you and I were just talking about that before. What that means is it's even harder to defy yourself than the crowd. That means you say, I've been believing X for so long, and well, maybe it's not true. We were talking about theories, and you notice that my theories tend to change over the years, that I come up with new theories every 5, 10 years or whatever. And the reason for that is because we know that all psychological theories are wrong. I mean, like, really. There is no psychological theory that I can think of that's ever been proposed that's actually lasted forever. Theories aren't meant to last. Even in physics, they're not meant to last forever. People thought Newton was it, but then came Einstein, and then turns out Einstein can't be all right because it doesn't fit in with quantum theory. None of our theories are right. So I have always felt that any theory I propose is not one forever, but it's the best I can do at the time, and then I'll keep working to make the theory better, or to change it as need be. But that's hard to do. And this is what I tell my students, that and it's ironic when you're a creativity researcher that some people come up with a theory of creativity when they're 30 or 35 or 40, and they never give it up. Because the hard thing about defining yourself is that there's so many forces that work against it. One is entrenchment, that you just get used to thinking a certain way. And that's a cost of expertise. The problem with being an expert is that experts often tend to get entrenched and stuck in a certain way of thinking. We've actually shown that. I did work with Peter French where we took experts and novices in bridge, and we had them play a bridge game. And of course, the experts did better than the novices. And then we either changed the surface structure of the game, relabeling the suits, the clubs, diamonds, hearts, and spades with new names. And when we did that, when we made a surface structure change, both the experts and the novices were hurt, but very briefly, and then quickly the experts were better than the novices again. Or Peter and I, and Peter's a professor at Humboldt University in Germany, actually past president of the university, and he was a graduate student of mine at the time. But when we made deep structural change, that is, we changed the rules for bidding. So it really was no longer just let's change some names, but the whole structure of the game was changed. And what we found is that deep structural change hurt the experts more than the novices. it actually impeded experts more because the experts were so entrenched and so routinized in terms of the rules of bidding. And so, what I learned at that point is that it's hard to give up, your ways of thinking because you're just entrenched in them. And the more expert you become, the more entrenched you become. And a second reason it's hard to give up on your views is because you're afraid that the next idea won't be as good. Like maybe you were lucky with the first idea, but you don't want to embarrass yourself publicly, as some people do, and come up with a second idea or a third idea that isn't as good. And then people will say, oh, look at him, he's on the way down. I mean, like this guy is really on the path to no man's land. So a second reason it's hard to defy yourself is because of the potential of embarrassment. And a third reason it's hard to defy yourself is because people have come to count on that idea. I mean, maybe you've published a lot of papers on it and you have acolytes, or maybe you have products or services you sell based on those ideas. And then all of a sudden people say, well, those products or services aren't worth anything anymore. So it may be resource costly in terms of people saying, hey, I should never have invested in those ideas because now he's given up on them. And I think the last reason that it's hard to change is just fear of the unknown. I've grown comfortable with this. I have established a career. I know where I am. And if I start with something new, I mean, who knows where I'm going to end up? Maybe in the toilet. So it's not exactly entrenchment, but just fear that, you're too old for this and it's safer to stick with what I have. So the second element of creativity in the triangular theory is being willing to let go, to say that, well, I've been thinking this way, and to realize that when you actually believe your theory is right, you're screwed. You're utterly screwed in terms of creativity, because then you'll never be creative again since you know the truth. And if you know the truth, why move on? When I was at Yale, there was a senior professor there who was actually a good friend of mine, and he used to brag that he never had a paper rejected and he never had a grant proposal turned down. And he was bragging, but I felt sorry for him because he was a guy who just never let go of his initial contribution and kept in a zone of safety. He didn't want to let go of it. So I think he got stuck. And then the third element in the triangular theory is define what I refer to as the zeitgeist, which is the prevalent world view. And by that I mean it's the things that everyone, including you, everyone accepts them, but you so accept them and you so take them as givens that you don't even realize that you hold them as beliefs. You just assume that's the way things have to be, that's the way they are, and they're never going to change because that's nature. And so a creative person attitudinally needs to defy themselves and defy the crowd, and also ask whether there are beliefs floating around that you just assume must be true, but that in fact aren't necessarily the case. So when I talk about creativity, that's what I mean. Now the theory is actually more complicated than that, but I don't want to, get real complicated in a podcast, so maybe that's enough for now.
It is powerful to say this triangular theory involves three kinds of defiance. Just to summarize, you're defying the crowd, even defying yourself, and you're defying the zeitgeist. And it seems like you've done that in your career, right? You've instead of studying intelligence over and over again for decades, you've changed your topics and you've changed your theories. So you practice what you preach. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and it has a cost. The thing your listeners have to remember is that creativity definitely doesn't come free in the sense that it makes people uncomfortable. Everybody says they like creativity, but what they really mean is they like it so long as it doesn't impinge on their life, so long as it doesn't make things difficult for them. One of the things my advisor, Wendell Garner, told me when I was an assistant professor at Yale is that the hardest papers to get accepted by journals and the hardest ideas to get accepted are the papers that really stink because they're crappy, and the papers that are really good and creative because those are the ones that threaten the existing order. And throughout my career, I've found that to be very sage advice. When you write a really groundbreaking paper, it's very hard to get it into a journal. And it's very hard to get it funded because inevitably there'll be people who say, if that's right, then that makes me look like a dope. And I don't want to look like a dummy. So their first reaction is to oppose paradigm defying ideas because they threaten their own work. And as you know, the way things work with journals, it only takes sometimes just one negative review, and certainly with grant proposals, for it to be all over. So if you choose for creativity, and I do think it's a choice, you're going to pay something for it because, like in my case, because I'm oppositional to blind use of standardized tests. So maybe you won't get invited to some prestigious conferences or grants. I can give you an example of what I'm talking about, actually, what I view as a cost of creativity. When I was a professor at Yale for 30 years, and toward the end of it, I was doing studies on college admissions. And the studies were about the usual measures, SAT and ACT measure analytical thinking. And what if we also measured creative and practical thinking, which were the three parts of my theory of intelligence? I haven't really much talked about it, but at the time it was called the triarchic theory. I do a lot of things in threes, even having triplets. It's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, so we constructed tests, analytical ability, which were similar to IQ tests and SATs and ACTs, which are all about the same thing, but also tests of creativity and of practical thinking. And we gave the test nationally to students all across the country who were in either grade 12 or freshmen in college. And the question was, would our tests of creative and practical thinking, this is what we were funded for, we're funded by a testing organization, would our tests significantly increase prediction of first year GPA? We knew that that was not an important criterion, but at that point we're getting small money and we're hoping if the study worked out, then we'd get bigger money. So we do the study, and the results were great. The test of creativity essentially doubled prediction of first year GPA. And this was, again, around the country for many different universities. So it wasn't just sort of done in one place. And not only did the test double prediction, and the tests of practical thinking also increased prediction, but not as much, but they substantially decreased ethnic and racial group differences. And that was something we didn't really expect. That there were, when we used our tests, we reduced the amount of difference between racial ethnic groups on the one hand. And when we looked at performance, we were, on the other hand, increasing prediction of performance. So it's hard to get that. It's hard to decrease group differences and increase prediction. So we thought the results were great, and the first empirical article was published as a lead article in the major journal in the field of intelligence. And I thought, this is wonderful. Now I'm going to get the really big money from the testing organization. And that's not what happened. They totally cut my funding off and said They didn't say it was because, well, your test makes our test look bad or anything like that. They said it was because we don't think you could upscale your test to be used with many more subjects than you had. So this was a really big blow to my career because I had been planning to do research on college admissions for a number of years, looking at how measures of creative and practical thinking could improve prediction and decrease group differences. And so I got pretty depressed, and I realized that no testing organization was going to fund me. And I had this not so brilliant insight that I was a bit of a dope to be surprised by what happened because, I mean, you'd like to think testing companies are different from everyone else, but if you do research, if you're funded to do research for a food company and your research shows that the food isn't so good for people, do you really think they're going to increase your funding? No, they'll cut you off. I mean, they want research that shows how great their food is. The kids love it and it's good for them too. More sugar is better. Or, doing research for a cigarette company and finding cigarettes or causes of cancer is not going to get you more funding, most likely. Or for a drug company, if you find their drug doesn't work, they're probably not going to fund you anymore. So I don't know why I didn't see that, but I hadn't. And, it's not, we didn't find that the SAT, ACT, those tests are terrible or anything. All we found is that you could improve on prediction that they provided, that you could do even better. So I went through this period of self examination and I decided that I would try to go into administration, academic administration, which I never ever thought I'd want to do. I mean, I sort of see myself as the opposite of an administrator, but I really wanted a chance to try out my ideas for college admissions. So I started, and I'd done some administration. I'd been president of the American Psychological Association. I was president of the Federation of associations in brain and behavioral sciences, and as president of 4 APA divisions, and been director of graduate studies and acting chair of my department. So I thought, well, I'll apply for deanships and I should do okay. And so I applied, and I could have papered the walls with rejections. I just got one rejection after another and another and another and another. And I was actually in a situation I had described in my talks on creativity, and that is that to be creative, you need to be really persistent. People are not going to like your ideas for the most part, usually. And even if they do, you're going to have a lot of people who pick holes in them. And you have to be very resilient and willing to face obstacles and overcome them. So here I was in exactly the situation I talked about. And I kept applying and applying. And finally, I said, I know I'm doing the opposite of what I say you should do in my talks, but I can't take another rejection. It's just too much. So I decided I'm going to give up. I'm going to just stay as a professor at Yale and do something else. And after I gave up, I figured, well, I've run out of places to apply to. I'd forgotten that there were a few other places I hadn't heard from yet. And I ended up getting 2 job offers and went to Tufts as dean, Tufts University in Medford, Mass, as dean of arts and sciences. But I was kind of faked out because I was writing the talks. I should have kept going. And by not following what I said you should do, I was actually on the wrong route. So I did go to Tufts, and it took a year of working with people. When you have ideas that are kind of paradigm changing, you really have to. One of the very important parts of creativity is kind of selling your ideas. It's talking to people and saying, this may sound a little weird or scary or offbeat, but this really could work. So I spent a year talking up these ideas from the Rainbow Project at Yale. And after a year of talking to people and saying, hey, look, this isn't going to cost Tufts any money. And the reason it won't cost them any money is I'll fundraise for it. And you know who I'm going to fundraise from? I'm going to fundraise from the graduates of Tufts who came in and got in but had bad SATs or ACTs, because often those are the ones who end up making the most money. They don't become academics or, highfalutin engineers. They become entrepreneurs or go into business. And so I fundraised for the project, and it worked great. We were able to admit students to Tufts through what was called Kaleidoscope, that otherwise never would have gotten in. And they did really well at Tufts. And then later, I went to Oklahoma State University in Stillwater as senior vice president and provost. And we introduced a project there that was similar to the one at Tufts, although adapted to the needs of Oklahoma State. And it worked great at Oklahoma State, too. So I guess what I'm saying is that so much of creativity is really what I learned my first year in graduate school, which is being true to yourself. It's that you wear the pants you want to wear. Don't tell your advisor you're going to study semantic memory if you want to do intelligence. Just be yourself. And you will get opposition, and some people ignore you, and some people will oppose you, sometimes quite personally, or they'll try to undermine you. But you'll be able to tell your kids, as I do, that you were true to yourself and you did what you believed in.
It's a powerful story about college admissions, and you called it, just to summarize, the triarchic theory, where you developed an assessment for three different traits, I guess you could say: analytic, creativity, and practical. And what we're assessing with the standardized tests like ACT and SAT, I guess you would say that's only the analytic. So it's leaving out the creativity and the practical. So
Yeah.
your research in the real world, it's not laboratory research, right? You did it in a university as a university leader in charge of admissions. So yeah, that's an incredible story. And what's been the impact? Are the universities out there, or was the resistance too great? Or are there some universities that have started to assess for creativity and practical abilities in their admissions?
Well, one thing I should add is that at Tufts, my theory of intelligence had already expanded, and it included wisdom-based items, because I realized that there are a lot of people who are analytically, creatively, and practically smart, but they're making the world a worse place. So wisdom based thinking became part of the theory. So Tufts used the program for many years. Lee Coffin was the dean, and then he went to Dartmouth, and I don't know if they still use it. I believe Oklahoma, I worked with Kyle Ray, and I believe Oklahoma State still uses the project. But it's been a very tough sell. Colleges are very entrenched. And what I discovered is that most of them aren't so concerned about measuring creative and practical and wisdom based skills. They're concerned about finances. An awful lot of administration really is about money and prestige. So their biggest concern was how we can get more kids who can pay to apply and enroll. For very selective schools, they could afford to be more daring, and some of them, I think, like Chicago, are. But for the large majority of schools, as you know, a lot of colleges are closing. Their main concern is getting enough paying students so that they can keep their doors open and keep teaching kids and giving degrees. These are tough times for colleges and universities.
On your website, and I'll put a link to that in the episode notes, you say that if you have one passion in your work, it's to see changes in the ways in which we teach and we test our children. So you said a lot about the testing, and especially in college admissions. Uh, could you tell us a little bit about teaching? How might we teach differently based on your research?
Yeah. So actually, that's I only gave you half the story for the colleges. I gave you the admissions half. So, but I forgot the teaching half. So I'm glad you asked me. Well, I didn't forget. I just at the time it didn't seem relevant. So when I did the projects at Tufts and at Oklahoma State, one of the things I said is that if you start admitting kids for their creative, practical, and wise thinking, you really need to open a teaching and learning center that teaches teachers how to teach in ways that value creative and practical and wise, as well as memory based and analytical thinking. And the reason is that if you don't do that, if you don't have such a teaching center, then what'll happen is you'll admit kids, but they won't be kids who will thrive under conventional ways of teaching. You may actually create a self fulfilling prophecy whereby you're admitting kids are creative, but they're not taught for creativity and they're rejected by teachers because they don't learn in traditional ways. And then the people in the school will say, well, I told you so. These kids can't succeed in their school. So if you're going to test in these ways, it's important also to teach in these ways, which is what I do. In all my courses, I teach for creative, analytical, practical, and wise thinking, which means my courses tend to be mostly discussion based and mostly essay based in terms of assessments because it's not enough just to test that way. You have to teach in a way that corresponds to the way you test. But I do think that there's a whole series of creative attitudes that I try to teach for in my classes. And when I say teach for, you can't say do this, but rather try to show why creativity is so much a matter of state of mind rather than some kind of inborn ability or fixed trait. And the kinds of attitudes I'm talking about, well, I talked about defying the crowd and yourself and the zeitgeist, but there's others like taking sensible risks, being willing to redefine problems, realizing that a large part of creativity is selling your ideas, it's persuading people who don't believe in what you're saying, being willing to overcome obstacles, having a sense of humor about yourself and not taking yourself so seriously that you believe you found the truth. That, when I was 30, I came up with this theory of creativity, and the reason I'm still at it when I'm 70 is because it was true then and it's true now. Well, that's not going to work. If you want kids to be creative, don't model being uncreative. So so those are examples of attitudes, and I think the most important attitude probably is, and this is what I tell my kids: the most important thing is finding what you love to do. And one of the things that's been very gratifying I have 5 kids, I have 2 older kids too, and the older kids found what's right for them. Seth, my older son, is a CEO of an elder healthcare company, and Sarah became a law professor studying poverty law at Duke. And the triplets, although they're only 13, Sammy wants to be numismatist, which means someone who specializes in rare coins. And Brittany wants to be a psychotherapist, and Melody wants to be a lawyer. And those that seem like really good fits to them. And the important thing is not whether they actually do those things. Seth and Sarah sort of tried different things before they came in. What's important is that they have some kind of goal, that they have something they're working toward, that they feel like, yeah, this is what I want to do, that I can make the world a better place. I very much emphasize in my teaching and research, especially on creativity, what I call transformational creativity, which is about how you can use creativity to make the world better rather than to make it worse, as so many people are doing today. Uh, so yeah, but I think this is all teachable. And if you can even teach kids that, don't go around saying, I'm not creative, I wasn't born creative, I've never been creative. That's not where it's at. Anyone can be creative if they adopt creative attitudes and are willing to do the kinds of things I was just talking about a few minutes ago. And they're willing to overcome the obstacles that inevitably you encounter when you do creative work.
It's a powerful and compelling message. And well, we're nearing the end of our time, and I like to end by asking one last question, which is, can you give our listeners some sort of advice or some exercise or activity that you could do in the next week, something they could do that might enhance their creativity?
Yeah, well, I would say if I had one piece of advice, and it's not about one thing you do, it's about something you creativity is a way of life. It's not about what you do one time, one thing, one place. And the main thing about creativity is oddly, it's truly to be yourself, is to find yourself. So many people find themselves by just listening to others. Like if they live with Democrats, they become a Democrat. If they live with Republicans, they become a Republican. If they do a certain, if they see their colleagues doing a certain kind of research, they do that kind of research. I mean, think a lot of the research that's published is really just the next small step in a paradigm rather than asking, is the paradigm even such a good one and the one we should be using? So I would say the main thing is that, yes, you can be creative. The main thing you want to do is to truly be yourself. Don't be like myself when I said I wanted to study semantic memory. Figure out who you want to be, what gives you purpose and meaning in life, and go do it and make the world a better place. And I emphasize the world a better place. Don't use your creativity for bad ends or to make things worse, but ask yourself, how can I say when I'm 60, 70, that the world is in some little way better for my having been in it. And that's what I want. When it comes to telling your kids when you're older, what difference have you made in the world? I think that if you've done something where you can say, I had this goal, I had this, what gave me meaning was this, and that's what I pursued. And it made some people happy and it didn't make other people happy, but it was me.
Dr. Robert Sternberg, thank you so much for being today on The Science of Creativity.
And thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate it.
Dr. Robert Sternberg is a rock star in the science of creativity. He's such a leading creativity researcher, but that's only one part of his career. I've looked up to him for my entire career because way back in 1995, my second scientific article was published in a book that he edited. It's called The Nature of Insight. He was already a top professor at Yale University even in 1995. And even after I've read a lot of his books and articles, I still learned a lot from this interview about the science of creativity. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.